How's it going, guys? This is another late night video, at least for me. I don't know about you, whatever time you're watching, whatever time zone you're in. I thought it'd be best I do this video before I make one about how to pick a racket or how to demo a racket. And I was thinking about this today. Would that idea be better done in 2 videos or in 1? Because I think demoing a racket is pretty different from picking a racket. We'll see what I do. This video is really about expressing what my preferences in a racket are. Now, whatever I look for in a racket isn't necessarily what you should look for in a racket, but I do have my own racket journey and I've gone over it a bit. I'm not going to talk about it much here. However, the set of criteria or preferences that I have acquired obviously play a very major role in the decision-making process for me when it comes to picking a racket. So as it stands, I want a racket to be somewhere between standard length and slightly extended. And what that means is something between 27 to maybe 27.5 inches long. I used to want something longer, but in a very recent video of mine, I explained a very real dilemma with extended length rackets. And just to recap, a lesson that I learned was the longer a racket is, the more unstable it has to be to still be within a reasonable swing weight. And the reason I say that is because when you extend a racket, you very quickly, massively increase the swing weight. And the only way to keep the swing weight down is by taking a lot of weight away from the head of the racket. So despite a higher swing weight, when you extend the length of the racket, you don't actually get the benefits of stability that you would from a standard length racket, which you would only be able to do by adding weight, right? Because on a standard length racket, you'd have to add weight to get a higher swing weight. And that extra weight is going to affect the stability positively. So extending a racket makes it harder to swing and doesn't really give you any benefits of stability. All you get is a little gain in the length, which can certainly help with things like reach and definitely with serve. But it can kind of be punishing all the time on every shot. So I used to really be all about extended length rackets and I'm not as much these days. However, that is still a piece of me that lives inside of me. I want a racket to be a little bit longer just to be a little different, I guess, partly, but I still like the idea of having a little extra reach. And your boy's got some big hands. But as a lot of you know, a racket like a Pro Staff, you just can't really get comfortably 2 hands on a racket like that. Some of you can. And some of you just aren't going to care that you're grabbing the throat of the racket on a 2-handed backhand. So to each their own. And that is kind of the point of this video, to each their own. This is my own, but my set of preferences and why they matter to me, maybe it'll help you decide if those preferences should also matter to you or not matter to you. And from there, you can kind of narrow down your selection and make your racket selection process easier. I've got to say, it's really helpful to know what you want. And I think on my racket journey, I definitely figured out a lot about what I want from a racket. Some of that is real stuff. And some of that is maybe a little bit more superficial, arguably more aesthetic. But at the end of the day, those are my preferences. And the fact that those are my preferences isn't really debatable. That is just the reality of it. And I can accept that. I don't know if some of you guys have a hard time accepting that. I think there's a camp of people out there that are just so like on the side of it being the player, not the racket. And you should just pick a racket and work on your tennis and stop thinking about rackets and strings. And I totally get it. That's not quite me, at least not at this point in time. And I absolutely don't want to discredit the contribution that the right racket and string combination can have on your tennis. Because there are just so many shots that are going to be a lot easier with some rackets and way harder with other rackets. It's really about figuring out the type of tennis that you want to play, what your strengths and your weaknesses are, maybe how much growth you have left to make in your tennis so that you can kind of close the gap that the racket isn't going to close. You know, I get all that. So if we can, for this video, I hope we can just understand that this is a video about my preferences. It shouldn't be some deep philosophical tennis conversation about the merit of any detail having any effect on your tennis whatsoever. But this is the internet. You can't stop them all. So let's get into it. What do I look for in a racket? I told you guys about the extended length, but where I stand on that right now, somewhere between 27, which is standard, maybe 27.5. Don't see myself going longer than that. The trade-off in swing weight and stability is just too great, I think, for me to enjoy the benefits of length at the sacrifice of things like stability and it being harder to swing and et cetera, et cetera. So I made that point. Let's move on to the next one. But it's relevant because now that I've dialed my preferences back to standard length, it really opened up the doors for me because there are so many standard length options, right? I was operating in a very tiny world of extended length rackets, did what I could to make them work at the time. Now I'm back to being okay with something standard or extended, really opens up the doors for me. However, a couple of preferences that really narrowed it down very, very quickly was first acquiring a taste or a preference for parallel drilling. Made a whole video about this. And the funny thing is that through that video, I was made aware of something that could be a bigger issue. So parallel drilling for me is kind of interesting because I do generally think it's better. I would prefer that a racket has parallel drilling. But if a racket has parallel drilling and it has big grommet holes, the crosses are going to look really crooked. And I've talked about this in quite a bit of content. It takes a while to explain it, so I don't want to do that in this video. I've already done it. You guys should check out my video on crooked crosses. I leave a link to that video in my descriptions recently because that conversation comes up. So check that video out if you want to know what I mean by crooked crosses. But ever since I noticed that, I was not able to look at rackets, especially with big grommet holes and parallel drilling, the same, which actually rules out quite a lot of rackets, including the blades, for example, from Wilson. But any racket with big grommet holes, even if it has standard drilling, is still going to have that crooked cross pattern issue around the sweet spot, which is like the last place I want to think about something like that being there. So yeah, that's kind of a borderline like OCD thing. A lot of people see that thing and they don't really care. But I think tennis players are kind of inherently a little bit more on the OCD side. So if you're one of the tennis players that's going to say you shouldn't think about that stuff, doesn't matter, it's the player, not the racket, I really feel like you're just not being understanding to the broader culture of the tennis consumer market. It's a pretty obsessive sport, and the consumer side of it is no exception at all. And you could even blame the marketing for this. Like, the marketing really wants you to care about the details. But that being said, people who are racket engineers designing these rackets and stuff, you think they're not putting a lot of thought into that? They're putting so much thought into this kind of stuff. So really, it's silly to dismiss any detail, really. I'm not saying you have to care as much as some people who really care, but to act like it just doesn't matter and the industry as a whole doesn't care or people shouldn't care, that's you start to lose my interest. You start to lose me at that point. Anyway, it was through explaining and doing deeper dives on parallel drilling that I was able to prioritize a preference over parallel drilling. Because for a moment there, that was like the most important thing. And that narrowed down the options a lot. But the crooked crosses issue really turned me off from parallel drilling, but I figured out that if the grommet holes are small enough, you won't be able to tell that the crosses are crooked because they won't be crooked. So big holes are out, parallel drilling or not. So my perfect racket would have small grommet holes and parallel drilling. But since I am so incredibly bothered by crooked crosses, a racket with smaller grommet holes is a much more important preference for me than parallel drilling. Parallel drilling is kind of like icing on the cake or a little cherry on top. I'd love for it to be there, but I don't absolutely require it. But thankfully, there are some rackets that have both, and I have some examples here. We'll get into that. A couple of these options here are actually different from some of my recent videos, so you'll see. Next, and this one's been a preference of mine for quite some time, I prefer a denser string pattern. Now, I don't necessarily mean I need it to be an 18 by 20. Really what I'm referring to is how far apart the strings are spaced. There was a time on this channel where I was pretty obsessed with the E-Zone 98 by Yonex, and the string spacing on that racket is actually surprisingly tighter than so many 18 by 20s out there. And the reason I cared about that so much was, sure, the control elements, but I was a string breaker. I still am. And before I was hitting with strings like Restring Zero and Toroline Wasabi, I would very often break strings in like 3 to 5 hits, which is annoying. You're buying like $15 to $20 strings, and you got to get your racket strung like twice a week because you're hitting every day. At least if you're me, you're hitting every day. And before anyone recommends that I hit with poly, maybe I'll break strings less. Obviously, I was hitting with polyester strings, and hopefully nobody recommends multi-filament or Syngut for any reason. That's actually like, it's becoming a pet peeve of mine. I think some people are going to enjoy pressing that button or making the joke to suggest multi-filament strings and Syngut. That's fine, but I still definitely get the occasional serious recommendation for Syngut or multi-filament, which I can't believe because I was breaking polyester strings, like durable polyester strings, like 17 and 16 gauge in a few hits. How much life do you think I'm going to get out of a multi? Generally, it's like 30 minutes to a couple hours at most. And I don't really like anything about multi-filament strings. I guess they're a little bit more comfortable, but the way that they wear, they fray so much and they sound like a creaky board in my string bed, and the strings move so much and they stay out of place. I don't even want to talk about it. I get mad just talking about multi-filament and Syngut strings. You want to get me triggered, just talk about multi-filament strings or Syngut. It's a great way to push my buttons. Anyway, the point is that I was hitting with durable strings. The only thing I could look forward to in a racket that would help me get more life out of a string was having a denser string pattern, right? Because the strings are closer together in the sweet spot and they can each distribute the load of the tennis ball on the strings across more strings, and therefore the strings should break later as opposed to sooner. And sure enough, with a dense enough racket, I could get like 1 to 2, maybe even 3 extra hits out of a tennis racket if the string pattern was dense enough. So I like denser string patterns. Every now and then I will check out a 16 by 19 if it's dense enough. The Head Radical Pro is actually a really good example of this. And this is my, at least at the time of this video, the most recent racket I have strung. And back when I was comparing every single string pattern to the EZO 98, this was a racket that on paper was actually quite similar. It was different in some meaningful ways, but it's a 16 by 19 with a pretty densely spaced string pattern. So when I compared it side by side, it's not a huge difference. And honestly, one of the breakthrough discoveries for me, opening the doors again for tennis rackets, was discovering one of my favorite strings of all time. This is Restring Zero. Looks beautiful in this racket, by the way, that blue and orange. This string is so durable. So remember I was talking about getting like 3 to 5 hits at best with durable polyester strings. I get like twice as much life with Restring Zero, and I get better spin. This string bites the ball, but also has such little string on string friction. So you get amazing snapback and amazing ball bite. I've said it in a lot of my videos. I've also said that in a lot of my videos. I haven't said that in a lot of my videos. Wow, this is getting meta. But this is absolutely one of the best strings for topspin. I really just say it's the best. And the only string that can even compete or be in the same conversation, in my opinion, is Tourmaline Wasabi. Also very, very similarly durable. Those strings reduce the friction so much, which also gives you so much topspin, that they don't destroy themselves. And it hasn't been that long that a string like that has really existed. So much of the market just doesn't even understand. So this string actually is so durable, as is Tourmaline Wasabi. And you can use my code to get discounts on both of these. Use my link in the description, click it, it'll apply automatically, or use my code Time for Tennis. Check them out if you haven't. They work really well in a hybrid, by the way. Tourmaline Wasabi and Restring Zero. Vice versa, full bed of each. Can't go wrong. These strings are so durable that they opened up the doors for me again. Now I'm not quite as stressed about having a dense string pattern because, again, these strings are just so durable. I can hit with a somewhat more open string pattern and still get like 10 hits out of it. And 10 hits with any string is pretty much it for me. I feel like even if the strings are still in the racket by that time, I might want to cut them out. But I always play it until Restring Zero breaks pretty much. Unless for some reason I strung it too high or way too low and I just feel like I need to cut it out because it's not working out. Sometimes you're getting to know a racket and it turns out that this tension with this string maybe isn't so good and you got to try again. But you usually always get that right on the second try. I'm personally a fan of stringing low, and that way I know that if it's too loose, it's easy to gauge like how much higher I should go next time. When you string too high, it kind of just sucks playing with the racket. And I think that it's harder to know how much lower to go versus when you string too low, how much higher to go. Funny thing, Restring Zero actually holds tension so well that when you string it too high, I feel like it's going to be too high for a long time. So yeah, that's actually another benefit to Restring Zero. If you care about tension maintenance, it's a phenomenal tension maintenance string. But yeah, if you string it too high, you can't really look forward to like, well, maybe the next day it'll be lower. Maybe not so much. So anyway, it is interesting as I've acquired these preferences over the years, which preferences kind of come and go, which ones open up the doors, which ones narrow it down. But I think that's pretty much where I'm at. There's some more basic preferences like head size and I guess weight kind of, but you know, I have a swing weight machine tool now that also measures twist weight. It's by Graffiti. It's in my last video. You can check that out if you haven't seen it. I bust a myth. I prove whether or not you can reduce swing weight by adding weight anywhere. Some people think you can reduce swing weight by adding weight into the handle. And in a way you kind of can. I explained that in the video. I'm not going to spoil it for you if you haven't seen it, but check it out. You'll also get to know the swing weight machine tool a little better from watching that. But since I have that tool now, it's very easy for me to customize a racket. So unless a racket is way too heavy, I'm not as shy about modifying a racket to have the kind of balance and weight and even twist weight how I want. That being said, I think I'm still kind of figuring out what exactly that is that I want. And the truth is, I don't really love putting a bunch of lead on a racket. So if a racket's too light as it is in stock form, I imagine the racket is just going to be like caked with lead tape. And I don't really want that either. So I want something heavy enough that I don't really have to do that. And if I do have to do that, I'm hoping it's pretty minimal and I can kind of hide it under the grommets once I know exactly where I want to put the lead tape. Because I kind of just think having lead tape exposed looks ugly. I want a pretty tennis racket. What can I say? Shame on me for caring about aesthetics, right? So maybe the last preference I will throw in real quick because it's not quite as like detailed and specific. I'll throw in a couple. You know what? No, let's just do the breakdown right now. What are my preferences? Let's start with the ones I haven't mentioned yet. So I like something kind of tweener spec. I could have just said that. I also wouldn't get a racket with a head size smaller than 95. I also probably wouldn't get one bigger than like 104. I have a Blade 104 here and I am taking it pretty seriously. I've played really well with it, but I think anything bigger than a 104 is getting into, maybe that's too much. So somewhere in there for the head size. I'm a little open-minded with that. And as far as flex rating goes, you know what? The flex rating I think is unreliable, for lack of a better word. There's so many rackets that have like a high 50s or a low 60s, and I swear it feels so much stiffer than a lot of rackets that are rated in like mid 60s. I mean, just the fact that the lower rated racket feels stiffer than the higher rated racket to me is like, what is this? And the problem with the way that flex is measured is that it doesn't really take into account things like hoop flex. Some rackets have a much thinner beam. And so measuring the flex at this point doesn't necessarily measure the flex of the racket head. As the racket head deforms and compresses a little bit on contact, that largely contributes to the feeling of flex or comfort. So flex rating is something you really have to take with a grain of salt. I don't even know if I can give you guys a number that feels like that's what I like, because you could design a blind test of rackets and have you or somebody rate them, right? They'd have the same strings and the same tension or something like that. And let's just say that on paper, their rating is like 65 for these 3 rackets, but they're not all gonna feel like that at all. That being said though, maybe I like something kind of in the mid 60s. And I have to just say that with the disclaimer of not all mid 60 flex rackets feel the same. And from there we have dense string patterns. These aren't necessarily in any particular order. I'm just trying to remember what I said. And I love me some parallel drilling. That's another one. But it can't be without small grommet holes. That one is very important. That one's way up there. That honestly might be the most important one. I really just can't stand to look at a racket and its crooked string pattern when it doesn't have small grommets. I just can't. I've looked at enough rackets to be able to pinpoint exactly where the problem is going to be just by looking at the racket. If it has big grommet holes, standard drilling or not. Standard drilling is better because around like the top third and the bottom third, there's too much angle for that problem to be visible, just with the way that the string ends up kind of leaning on one of the edges of the grommets. But in the middle, in that sweet spot area, it's going to be a problem. So just to share some examples here, actually, this head radical has a really interesting grommet system. So it does have small holes, so the strings are very secure in here, but they're also parallel drilled. However, there's an extra innovation on this grommet system because the grommets are kind of oval shaped on most of the crosses, which is cool because it allows for a little bit of string movement, like with the depth of the string bed. I think that's pretty cool. But it doesn't allow for movement like up and down. So no crooked crosses, but it maybe has some of the benefits of a larger grommet hole system without that terrible, terrible aesthetic. So there's an example with parallel drilling and small grommet holes. This is one with standard drilling, but small grommet holes. It's a Procanex. Head gravity NP, probably not going to mess around with it for too much longer, but another example, small grommet holes and parallel drilling. However, no oval shape on the grommet holes for the crosses, just standard shapes. The Blade 104 and the Blade 102, very interesting grommet system. So parallel drilling also, and small holes. However, there's like a channel cut out in the cross section that allows for a similar string movement that the head radical might achieve by having an oval shaped grommet. So again, a pretty innovative system, but still small grommet holes, no crooked crosses, parallel drilling. I'm so into it. Both of these are 18 by 19, so that's cool too. And those would be my extended options for now. So there you have it. I think those are all my preferences and a brief journey on how I acquired those preferences and why they are important to me. Again, don't expect my preferences to be important to you, but they are to me, and that's fine. I think part of your guys' racket journey has to be about being okay with what you care about and okay with what you don't care about. And you have to accept your level, and you have to accept how much growth you want out of your tennis and how much you expect a racket to be able to help you in that development. But you also want to be able to put into context a bit what qualities and characteristics from a racket are going to have on your tennis. Like what traits might help with topspin or plow through, what specs are maybe more appropriate for your level, or maybe the level that you want to be. Maybe are these specs out of my range? Is this going to hold me back or is it going to help me grow? So those are the type of questions I want to answer in one of my next videos. But this one covers my preferences. So thank you so much for watching. I look forward to your guys' comments on this one. Let me know if you have any questions regarding anything said in this video or questions you might have for a future video, especially if it's for how to pick a racket or how to demo a racket. I'll try to answer those either in the comment section or in a future video. So thanks again for watching. Battery's dying. Check out the links in the description and be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next one. Good night.